Okay, we're on air now, right? No?
Yeah, now it is on.
Okay, now we're on air. Good morning, everyone. Daniel Norell is with us today. I'll quickly introduce him and then we can start our session. Daniel is director of the Daniel Norell is an architect, researcher, and educator based in Stockholm. He's co-founder with Einar Rode of the collaborative architecture practice Norell Rode. The work of Norell Rode ranges from competition-winning schemes for cultural buildings and landscapes to residences, interiors, and installations. The practice frequently participates in publications and exhibitions, and their work has recently been shown at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale, ArcDes, Sweden's National Center for Architecture and Design, Form Design Center, Yale University, Syracuse University, and at Aalto University. Daniel is director of the master's program in architecture and urban design at Chalmers University in Gothenburg and has previously taught at the KTH School of Architecture in Stockholm. He was a fellow in architectural technology between 2013 and 16. He holds a master's degrees in architecture from University of California, Los Angeles, as well as the KTH, and has previously worked with Greg Linform and Zaadid Architects. So that's Daniel for you guys. And maybe we can just quickly start with a general discussion of architecture and then narrow it down to how you specifically in your office tackle certain issues. The very first one, in the last few years, we have seen a shift in interest in architecture from the digital to new ideas that do not necessarily abandon digital technologies, but open up the discipline to a wider discussion. Considering your professional and academic background, having worked with architects that intensively use digital technologies, and later as a research fellow in architectural technology at the KTH, how has your work evolved over the years at Norell Rode?
I mean, just to start somewhere, I think that although it's true that I worked for some of the most digital architects out there, and actually Einar and I were both educated during a time when digital technology was, let's say, the currency in academia. I also think that, I mean, there's often talk about a shift right now, and even as I've learned, the Turkish pavilion, the exhibition has the title, The Shift. But I have to say that also in terms of my background, working with the architects that I worked with, I also learned that technology is not cannot be the driver of anything. In fact, technology doesn't is no guarantee for ideas or for discourse. So I think that, you know, both in Greg Lynn's office and in Zaadid's office, you used technology heavily, but you talked about architecture as opposed to talking about technology. So I think although it's often portrayed like there's a shift, in my case, I think I also learned a lot about how to engage with technology from those practices that I worked with. But I think it's true, though, that for both my partner Einar Rode and myself, that we did go to school during a time when academia was dominated by discourse, and where discourse centered on things like performance, emergence, and diagrams. And it's probably true that there was a certain, let's say, techno-positivist tone to how architecture was discussed, and that technology and the promise of a future came to, or was used as a way to justify design. I don't know. I think you can maybe compare. You can make a kind of blunt comparison between how technology entered, or digital technology entered, into architecture, and how and what happened when the internet was born. That you can draw a parallel that when in the early days the internet was understood as something very utopian, probably that would aid democracy, connect people, erase borders, and things like that. But as time has shown, those things have probably happened to a certain extent. But at the same time, I also, there are also things like filter bubbles, fake news. So the internet is by no means a guarantee for, things like democracy or erasing borders. And I think it's the same with technology and architecture these days, that it's no guarantee for interesting discourse, or technology has become mainstream to a certain extent. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. Yeah, there was just as you said, there was a techno-positivist, let's say, feeling in architecture, and some people still, believe in that architecture. Like someone like Mario Carpo, he argues that architects cannot take a sidestep in response to new technologies, because we have a responsibility to be a part of a discussion on how these new technologies are going to shape our lives. I mean, just like you said, there was a promise of a better, maybe, future with technologies, and some of it has happened and some of it hasn't. And that as architects, we have a responsibility to talk about how technology might shape our lives. And if we don't, someone else will, make that decision for us. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think that, like, in terms of our work, I think there are two, like there are currently almost like two camps pursuing work that has been labeled by some people as post-digital. I'm not sure that that's a good term, but I think that you can separate out maybe a few issues that are being worked on at the moment. And I think one issue is, or one project almost, is more of an aesthetic kind, and has not so much has not so much to do with technology. It has more to do with representation and positioning a new aesthetic project with other, let's say, formal tropes compared to what was around during the heydays of the digital. But I think there's also maybe a more, in a certain way, a more profound project that has to do with how we as architects can engage or re-engage with the digital, but under completely new circumstances, where the digital is no longer like a magical tool that's put on a pedestal, let's say, but it's something that's everywhere around us, and it shapes our daily lives and our habits. And I think that has changed since, let's say, the digital revolution in architecture. And I think it's an open question how we as architects adapt to that. But I think that adaptation has to take place both in terms of, let's say, process and representation and tooling, but also in terms of formulating new aesthetic projects. And I think partly intentionally, partly by chance, our practice has been associated with, through exhibitions and publications, with both of those types of projects. But I also have to say that I don't think that, like, in our practice, we don't discuss how we can best be post-digital, let's say, or we don't we just do work, and then occasionally we sit down to think about the work and how the work suggests some more general possibilities and how projects could emerge from the work.
I mean, while we started talking about your office and your projects, can you quickly tell us about how your approach has been like changing over time, or has it been consistent since you started? I mean, have you always been approaching design in a similar way, or are there different has there been different ideas that shape the way you approach design?
I mean, of course, things evolve. We founded the practice some 5-6 years ago. So things evolve. I think one thing that has happened, and that you also addressed in one of your questions, is that we tend to more and more, let's say, depart from existing objects or materials in the design work that we do. And I think that, like, if you zoom out a bit, I think that has to, like, you can position that too in relation to like a previous discourse on the digital. In like, I mean, I'm sure many of us remember how design used to be something like in a 3D modeling software that would start from lines and curves that were later turned into surfaces and solids, and then even later were given a materiality or were given some more unique characteristics. I think what we're interested in is kind of almost reversing that process and say, what if you start with a unique object or a unique set of materials and use that as your kind of stock or starting point, and see where that sort of takes the process, and how qualities can be and characteristics can be sourced or borrowed from those objects or materials that you start from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And while we started talking about material reality, can you start talking about maybe specific projects, in particular, maybe the interior in, I think it was in Södermalm in Stockholm, the, excuse my Swedish, but Klumpe Dunser, with porous and rough surfaces of expanded clay aggregates, and they're combined with vibrantly colored smooth fiberboards and glass. And then there's grain figures project, where you have natural pattern of the plywood that defines surfaces. And then another project, the two-phase furniture. There's a strong contrast between reflected painted surfaces and intense materiality of cement and ballast. I mean, how does those projects relate to each other, and where does the idea of the materiality get embedded in the project?
Yeah, let's see if I can just pull up some slides here. I think I have to just flip around a bit to find the different projects, but let's start with grain figures. So this is a recent project of ours that's now at the Biennale in a collateral event just outside of the Giardini. I think this is an example of how we start design by looking at the specific unique pieces of material. So part of the idea with the project was to say that was to take a standard material like plywood and then document, seek out and find and document unique pieces of plywood with regards to their grain and to their patterning. Almost like if you would, so to treat let's say not so highly regarded material as plywood as if it was a very precious material, like an architect would go to Italy to find unique pieces of marble. and then document those pieces of plywood and have the grain of the plywood start to guide how we would cut it using a CNC cutter. So how figures would start to emerge out of the pattern in the plywood. So we looked at a phenomenon from carpentry called grain figures, which is a term that carpenters have invented to find and identify different figures in a random variation of patterning in the wood. So here are some of them. The most common one is the crown, where plywood is built from thin sheets of veneer that are cut in a spiraling fashion from a log of wood. So depending on how you slice through knots and defects in the wood, different patterns would emerge. So the premise of the project was pretty basic. Like, we played around with drawing curves on top of documented unique pieces of plywood to find figures in the plywood, and to find characters in the plywood, or to find design sensibilities in the grain. And here's the installation in the greenhouse, Serra dei Giardini. And plywood is a one-sided material, so that's also a practical reason for why the contrast between the painted surface and the grain surface. So because plywood is artificial, the same grain does not appear on two sides of the plywood. Let's see if I can also we can also look at another project that you mentioned. Maybe, let's see. Well, let's do this. And here's the interior that you mentioned. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So here the idea was to borrow some qualities from materials that you normally associate with building construction and bring those into the world of furniture. So a kind of mismatch of materials, if you want. So this is probably the cheapest material you can find, at least in Sweden, the light clay aggregate, light concrete building blocks. And to see how that rough materiality what kind of work that could do if you used it for furniture. And also to see if just the basic proportions of those building blocks would lend proportions to pieces of furniture that, sort of took them somewhere else or out of a regular set of proportions that you would find for furniture. So we thought that it was exciting to use something that had a very rough materiality in another ways sort of clinical environment of interior and beauty salon. But again, I think that what this project has in common is to look closely at the material and to with the previous one, look closely at the material and see almost how variations, as in this mortar seam, how variations in the clay aggregate could give us a seam or a mortar joint that would be different for different blocks, and that would vary and have an intense materiality.
just to quickly interrupt, for example, for this project, did you start with an idea of materiality about roughness and smooth, and that you would later find the materials that would do the job for you, or did you, let's say, come across this expanded clay bricks and thought that would be a very good starting point for the project?
Actually, in this case, it was pretty straightforward. We went on an excursion to the to Home Depot or the equivalent, and looked at different cheap materials and kind of got a sense for materials that we could use that had an intense materiality, and that where we could get a lot of let's say bang for the buck. So it did start from the project did start from this particular material.
And for example, for the two-face furniture, was that how did the process work there?
Let's see if I can find it. Well, here I mean, I think here part of the background, there's a background story that has to be told, which is that this was a competition for a very strange ghost town in Latvia called Karosta. It's an abandoned USSR naval base. So it's a ghost town because no one has lived there since the 80s. It has fallen into despair, but it has later picked up as a popular spot for what's called ruin porn tourism, or which is a strange hipster type of tourism where people go to see buildings in despair. But it has also become a home to a vibrant art community. So it's a strange place that in our interpretation holds two types of materialities. There's the grandness of the previous era, the Tsar era, the cathedral that you can see in the background, and of Tsar palaces. But there's also the ruins and the kind of fallen apart Soviet era blockhouses. So we wanted to kind of borrow those two materialities and work with those in these objects or in these public furniture pieces for the city. So that's why we in the project talk about these two material worlds that exists with each other, and that in the project helps to shape spaces by distinguishing between inside and outside and so forth.
And maybe besides materiality, association with existing objects, forms, and spaces is a recurring theme in your projects as well. For dead ringers, for example, tweak existing booths, 9 rooms, play with pre-war apartment rooms. Rebro water reservoir brings to mind barrels and casks. In all cases, you take something we know and turn it into something new. Can you talk about the role of the familiar in your work?
Yeah, let's. I'm going to go see if I can find dead ringers here. I think again, part of the story is that we're interested in the characteristics of an object or of a material, and the agency that those characteristics give that object in the world. So part of the point with borrowing characteristics, whether those are formal features or materiality from an existing object, is to also borrow some of that object's or material's agency, what it does or what it can do in the world. sometimes the point might be to amplify those characteristics, and sometimes we work to subvert them or to flip them around. But I think ultimately it's about giving architecture agency by playing with found and existing forms and materialities, and see how those can be received by a subject or by the public, let's say.
And how about nine rooms, for example?
Yeah, I think that project has a similar story to it. Let's see if I can find it here. I mean, here, the context of this project was an exhibition, so it's a much more, let's say, serious context and project in which the task was to design a monument for the Poles who rescued Jews during the German occupation of Warsaw. And often those people were hidden in the homes of Poles. So our idea was to, look at pre-war homes and typical formal features of those, as you can see in these images that we sourced from online archives, and to borrow some of those features to create a monument that would bring to mind some of those apartments and some of those rooms, but also to design a monument that was not a traditional kind of monument that you would sort of stand in front of, but one that provides a public space in itself, where you would be able to kind of step into the monument and step into the picture almost as a visitor. So essentially, those rooms are those rooms that we have sort of sourced from the apartments are carved out of a single block of concrete, but they're not, unlike in a typical apartment, let's say, they're not aligned through axiality or through doors and frames, but they're scrambled as if they have been left in a hurry, or as if they have been, subjected to some catastrophic event. And it's where, but what that does is that it creates intersections between the rooms, so that you can walk around in the monument, and you also open up views to the park around it. So here are some of the profiles that we sampled from rooms, and they're adjusted to so that they would form more of a coherent whole. And here you see the section with the open air rooms, and then here more of a detailed view with where it becomes apparent how different rooms and profiles intersect each other, and the kind of strangely familiar features that gives rise to.
And in addition to these things that we talked about, existing objects, materiality, you already talked briefly about figures in your Biennale exhibition, but that also the ideas of a character and figure come up in other projects as well, like the Anderson Museum and the Skellefteå, again, excuse my Swedish, Kulturhus projects. The massing is an assembly of parts with different character. Can you talk about the relevance of these two concepts in your projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think with figure, we have talked about something we called the object-figure misfit, which is basically when the figure of something that you see doesn't really or only partially aligns with your expectations of such what such an object would be. So I think for that, Dead Ringers is a good example where part of what you see connects to gives a subject an association to an existing object, but there are also other parts that are not recognizable and that open up for new narratives and new interpretations. So that's about figure. I think figure and character are often used interchangeably. I think we often talk about character more as as sort of almost like a personality that you can, through design, lend an object or lend a building, and that personality may have to do with how you kind of create that personality. May have to do with proportions. It may have to do with fenestration, with roof forms, with how the mass touches the ground. So things like that we often play around with in our projects. And like if you, on another note, I think that, a character is something that's distinct. It's not like, even if you group characters or masses together, they are still discernible as distinct objects, which I think is another important thing in this context, that to give a large building like the Skellefteå Cultural Center multiple identities by composing it from many different masses with different character or personality, let's say, so that what the building sort of communicates is not a single identity or a single vision, but that of a group or of a collective, which in turn, in our mind at least, gives it a different institutional identity.
What would you say? What would you say that would be the importance of having multiple readings and this, and how that relates to the identity of the institution?
I think it's difficult to give a general answer to that question, because the associations that someone may make the associations that a subject may make when they encounter something is individual, and it's dependent on culture and on context and things like that. But that's also one of the reasons that often in our project we try to engage context, but perhaps in a not so conventional way. But so in the case of Skellefteå, we can look at that project a little bit. In the case of Skellefteå, I think an important part of the story was that this is a small city in northern Sweden. What they wanted to do there was to take different existing cultural institutions in the city, like a theater, like a library, like 2 art galleries, and so forth, and bring those together to form more of a sort of critical mass, and almost as an excuse to give those institutions more presence in the city, to bring those together into a fairly large cultural center. So part of the idea was in the competition was to be able to say that each of those institutions would also show up and have their own identity in the massing of the building, and they would all have a slightly different personality. And as you would approach the building, those different institutions could be sort of sensed, but as a group, as a collective, not as necessarily as individuals, nor melted together into one continuous mass, let's say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Do you want to show slides of the project, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I just did. I forgot to share the screen. Let's do it now. So sorry if I'm repeating a bit now, but so here are, again, the city wanted to bring together existing cultural institutions. So here are those different institutions and different functions of the program identified as singular buildings and masses. So again, the idea would be that as you would approach the building, you could sense the presence of each of those institutions as part of a larger collective. So both, things like proportions, fenestration, but also color would be used to distinguish between the different institutions. So again, I think that the project was partially a response to the context and an opportunity to explore some of those ideas that you mentioned about character and figure. As a kind of interesting, an interesting effect of this was that because of the size of the building, which was more than 20,000 square meters, the interior of the podium that kind of connected all these individual masses became almost like the Campo Marzio, where you would have buildings bunched together but without streets. So you would see the footprints of, you could sense the footprints of the large masses above the podium. This would, and you could sense the orientation and different rotation of each of those masses in dense column grids and in load-bearing walls below. But there would also be open spaces and almost like piazzas and squares and so forth. But I think, again, like for a museum or for a cultural institution like this, the institutional identity is always important. And I think part of the aim here was to give each of those institutions a sort of presence on the exterior, but also to give the whole, ensemble a kind of playful, informal identity where everything does not seem to be sort of properly in its place. Or, yeah, I think you get the idea.
All of the you showed. Are we okay? In all of the projects that you showed, there seems to be always a play on duality. Like in the last project you showed, it's about the individual versus the collective. And in some of the projects, it's about the duality of the materiality of the project, smooth versus rough, reflective versus non-reflective. Or about, like in the one in the reservoir, we kind of sense something familiar, like the barrels, but then there's something totally new and strange. And the project seemed to be like a setup for this kind of duality. Is that something that you specifically target in your projects?
I think that's a good observation. That, and I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I think that one thing that we sort of learned or developed over time is that those contrasts that you're talking about can also give the project a sort of narrative. Like they can almost like in a like in a good story, there's always a villain and a good guy. And that sort of conflict can trigger associations. It can trigger it can trigger new relationships with the public and with visitors, and that becomes like something that can unravel as you look at the project. But it's not. I don't think it's our intention to like it hasn't been our intention to let's say work with conflict or with fragmentation or things like that. This is, but maybe I think it would be more correct to phrase it as to engage different extremes or engage contrast and to a certain extent contradiction.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I'd like to open up the discussion to the participants as well. Maybe they might have questions for you, guys.
I have a question. Where are you all from? Are you from an architecture school or from different schools or?
Mostly, most of us are from Turkey, from different architecture schools, including like ITU and Middle East Technical University, Fatih Sultan Mehmet University, MEF University, and also we have like foreign. I mean, one from Delft, and also from Munich. Yeah, that's like that. Do you have any other question, or can I just?
No, I was just curious.
I mean, you mentioned you start with this kind of unique set of objects or materials as a starting point. And I mean, like borrowing characteristics and agency of those objects you select. I mean, it's. I mean, I didn't check all the projects, but it seems like you have this kind of methodology in design you apply on in many projects, like to find the critical reference point. I mean, it might be about the context or something like that. You find critical, and you find a way, like an irregular or irrelevant way, or maybe relevant in a I don't know, in a different position, and you take some parameters from that that thing you found, and you use those parameters to rule the design process. So that way, maybe I thought we can discuss that. Probably all of us are educated in the era that this parametricism was on rise. And this is, of course, not like a digital connecting of things or parameters, but more like a way to find, to do a manual, like an analog parametrization and relation of things. I mean, you of course don't like go to a very certain end result from the start, but you design this methodology in order to like take some input from the things you find interesting and related about the job.
Yeah. I don't really think about it as a methodology, which sounds a bit too prescriptive to me. But I think I get your point. I'm not sure how to discuss I'm not sure how to discuss this in relation to, you know, parametricism and such things. But I think maybe if you zoom out a bit, one way to think about it is that, you know, something like parametricism or other approaches to architecture, they're not just approaches in terms of how you go about things. they might also contain ideas about how you experience architecture, or about how you are about attention, let's say. So if you think about, if I think about, parametricism, I associate that with a certain model of, let's say, attention, which would be sensation, which is like that, to say that as you experience architecture, you experience architecture very much as an immediate sensation, as something that, to quote Deleuze, is grafted directly onto the nervous system. So that's one model of attention, let's say. I think another model that we're more interested in is one that is slower and that draws the subject in slowly, and then through associations and through engagement unravels over time, and that sustains interest over time, instead of being like a very short-lived flash, let's say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that somehow relates to ideas in postmodernism, that your projects by association communicate meaning to people who experience the buildings or the projects?
Good question. I mean, I think yes. I mean, it does relate to that, but I'm not sure that it's always meaning that's at stake. It might also be there might also be other ways of, framing that sustained interest, or framing that, communication, let's say, that occurs between a subject and architecture, or a subject and an object. Another way of framing it would be would be allusion, that one object or one building can allude to another. That's also, of course, a postmodern concept, but one maybe that avoids things like symbolism and those types of meanings. But I think it's an interesting that's an interesting question, and it's worth it's one that we're thinking about, and one that's worth investing in, looking at. Interesting problem.
Any other questions, guys? You can turn on that mic.
Hello, I'm Marve. My question is about one of your projects, is Erotic, which I see from the images you have some digital methods to create the project. Then during the fabrication process, I'm curious how to achieve that digital way to something real, because between these two things, there are some maybe distortions or something different that you imagine. Maybe you can mention about that fabrication process of the project.
Yeah, let's see if I can share the screen again. So this is the project. This was one of our first projects, and at the time, we were obsessed by this idea of noise as a not as in sound, but as in a disturbance that would enter into a translation between, let's say, digital and analog, or between analog or digital, for that matter. So part of the idea with the project was to design something, but leave a lot of the design agency up to the material. So in this image, you can see all those small points that constrain what's essentially like a big sack. So we were in control of the position of those points, but then the material helped us to, let's say, quote unquote, design the piece in all the areas in between where it's sort of wrinkled. So because this was a rather large installation, it was impossible to do design iterations by always doing a big mock-up. So we simulated the behavior of the material in the computer. So essentially, that's another take on this idea of starting with the qualities or properties of a certain material, as opposed to starting with, let's say, geometry in the design process. So we looked at different massings that were inspired by erratic blocks that you find all over the Nordic region, and then eventually developed one of those massing studies into the design. The fabrication for this is not shown in these images, but the fabrication of the object was fairly tricky and fairly manual. So we designed like a big sack that was manufactured in a factory, and then out of foam rubber, and then it was assembled on site in Helsinki by attaching all those small points that you see in this image. So essentially, in the gallery space, the erratic behaved like a big boulder, in the sense, like a big rock, in the sense that it shaped space around it in the space, but its inside remained inaccessible and let's say mysterious. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very inspiring. And I think it's quite amazing and specific that each of these projects have their own point of departure, but in a mass, they kind of seem like this moment between reality and the dream. Maybe something like a Wes Anderson movie. And at the end, on each of these buttons, you click on the website, you show us mostly a analog model or a physical model and some drawings and sometimes a rendering. And I'm curious about the process behind or that leads towards these manifestations or these things, and basically the use of representation in your design process. And maybe also interact with your partner and how this comes to life.
I think we like to, I mean, as you're correctly pointing out, we like to work across media a lot. So we like to have this project develop, across drawings, physical models, renderings, computer models, and have those things up and running in parallel. And that's also why if you look at the website, there's a mix of those different types of media present, and that has always been important to us. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I think in our case it helps to review the project from many different angles, and it helps finding a narrative for a project to work across those different media.
Daniel, thank you very much for being with us here today. That was very inspiring, and we're looking forward to seeing more projects from you guys.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. And good luck with the workshop.
Thank you very much. We'll talk later.
Yes.
All right. Bye.